Hi everybody, so we're back in the room. Holly, just to check, we haven't done another presentation, have we, this time? This is more discussion.
Sorry, Justin, I missed half of what you said.
I was just checking, we don't have another presentation as part of this breakout room session, do we? We're just continuing with the discussion.
As far as I'm aware, we're going back over the same. We're repeating the same presentation from before, from the first breakout room.
Oh, okay, we'll repeat. Okay, because we've got a second set of delegates with us. Yeah, right. Okay, I'm with you. Okay. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, guys. Okay, just share my screen. And can I check if you can see that all right?
Yep, that's good, Chris. Again, all looking good.
Great. Cool. Okay. I'm just wondering whether I should vary things up a bit from the presentation and maybe go into some of the more detail about the kind of metrics and values and approaches used. I guess I'll go through this fairly quickly, and then we can get into some of those questions, and if that's of use or of interest to people. But yeah, this is an overview of the Natural Capital Laboratory project. I'm an environmental economist at ACOM, also a trustee of the LifeScape project. It's a rewilding charity. And the Natural Capital Laboratory is a joint venture, which is a kind of nature-based solution rewilding project combined with an outdoor laboratory that's trying to develop better ways of capturing data, measuring impacts and looking at the value of those impacts and trying to communicate them to different stakeholders. It's a joint venture between 4 different parties. So there's Amelia and Roger Leese, who are the landowners. There's the University of Cumbria, who are providing kind of academic leadership and also leading some of the IUCN's work on rewilding and nature-based solutions. There's the LifeScape project, which is a rewilding charity working in the UK and internationally. And then there's ACOM, who are a big design engineering company, and I work within the natural capital team within ACOM. A lot of the work that I do with clients is around sort of investment decisions and finance, and basically trying to convince people to spend money on this kind of project by recognizing the value that they deliver and developing the kind of like economic models for capturing those values and getting them recognized in decision making. A lot of the challenges we face, I think, are around how you collect data and value things and monitor impacts and actually build the evidence base to make the case for these sorts of things. And one of the things we wanted to do in the laboratory project was to basically have a safe space to carry out research, try out new techniques, see what works, and kind of pilot things, and then collect the data and analyze it and see, how we can then turn that into solutions for clients. So to give you a little bit of context, the site itself is based up in the Highlands of Scotland. It's about 45 minutes from Inverness and half an hour south from Loch Ness. It's a beautiful kind of rural area of the Highlands. It covers about 100 acres. So quite a small site. One of the advantages of a small site is that we can monitor it quite intensively. It's quite a complicated project to describe. There's lots of various bits and lots of different organisations and teams and specialists working on various things. But the kind of unifying themes behind the project are, the first theme is sort of rewilding. So the idea is to take this site, which is degraded from a number of reasons, and start to restore the ecosystems on the site, to sequester carbon, provide a home for biodiversity and a range of other ecosystem services, to start looking at bringing species back that have been lost from the area, to play kind of important ecological functions that allow the site to continue. And then also to engage communities and people in the project and build a relationship with them and the land and the landscape. And so it's not just sort of nature focused. And the work's being led by the landowners and the rewilding team at LifeScape, but also some of the professors at the University of Cumbria who are leading IUCN's work on kind of defining principles and guidelines for rewilding and nature-based solutions projects. Then alongside this rewilding process, as the site changes, we've set up this kind of outdoor laboratory where a number of different groups and organizations are involved in research. The research is kind of focused around 3 main themes. The first one's around data collection. So a lot of these models and valuation estimates and monitoring techniques, they all rely on data. What we're interested in is how we can make data better, cheaper, faster to collect. If this is going to be rolled out at scale, we need a huge data revolution. This is already happening in many sectors. So what we're looking at is applying some of these techniques in the environmental sector, things like drones and robotic rovers and AI, thermal imaging cameras to collect as much data as possible to allow us to understand what's happening as a result of the Rewilding project. Then looking at capitals accounting. So at the heart of the NCL, each year we produce a natural capital account, which has quantitative estimates of the change in the assets, the change in their condition, their extent, the flows of ecosystem services and the values generated. We're also extending this beyond natural capital to start looking at some of the other impacts around the more social and economic side of things. So we've been developing social and intellectual capital accounts, and we're looking at human capital this year, both financial and manufactured capital. And we're really interested in how we can improve on some of the models and data sources that are used in this to get better value estimates more easily. And third strand's around communication. So how can we take technical information and make it more accessible and engaging to people, especially from a non-technical audience? So using things like virtual reality and 3D models and digital platforms to allow people to interact with data and understand changes in the environment more easily, build that kind of like social capital buy-in and relationship with different stakeholder groups. Those are the sort of main themes of the laboratory. I realise it can be quite an abstract process to kind of like think about this sort of thing without any visual context. So this is a quick video taken from some of the drones that are flying over the site to give you a little bit of an overhead of what the site looks like. Habitat-wise, is quite an interesting mix. It's broadly split down the middle of the site with areas of plantation woodland and old birch woodland on one side, a strip of clear felled woodland, and then some peat bog area, which has been planted with trees before the site was acquired by us, and then a river which bounds one side of the site, and a path that sort of runs its way down through the site. This is a 3D model that's been generated by some of the drone footage that we're using in some of the things like carbon analysis on the site. You can see there a quick sort of overview of what it looks like and what we're working with. That's the overview of the site. We're just about to kick off year 3 of the lab. In year 1, this is a quick overview of some of the things that we did. So the first side of things was doing all the kind of baseline surveys, trying to understand what was on the site and what the environment was like and the condition and the assets and what species were there, etc. We then developed a natural capital account and developed a kind of digital platform interface to allow us to take what's essentially a spreadsheet document with a lot of numbers in to make it a kind of like more visually engaging way of kind of measuring and monitoring the environment. You can access that on the NCL website. Then quite conscious of the fact that if we're kind of restoring a forest ecosystem, it could take sort of hundreds of years for it to sort of get to that point that we're looking for in terms of having a sort of flourishing ecosystem. Most stakeholders aren't going to be around then, so what we wanted to do was to create a virtual reality experience that would allow people to see what it might look like and immerse themselves in what the future ecological scenarios might be for the site, depending on the decisions we make. Then we started looking into remote sensing. So how can we use satellite imagery and AI to replicate what ecologists are doing on the ground in terms of habitat monitoring, extent and condition. Looked setting up repeatable drone surveys so they could fly over fixed paths over the site to collect information in a systematic manner so we could monitor change remotely. And then also developed a social capital account. So basically transferring this idea of natural capital accounting into a social capital area, and looking at relationships between different stakeholder groups and how we could monitor those quantitatively and how we could start to measure the benefits of those relationships and maximize the value through this process. which I think is key to these kinds of projects that has been mentioned, is getting people involved and getting building that sort of social capital side to create a long-term sustainable footing for the project. Year 2, which has just finished at the end of September. There was a bit of a struggle with COVID, led to a bit of a delay and all sorts of problems getting to the site and doing all sorts of things. We've got through it and things are looking up a bit now. Basically, the focus in year 2 was around doing a deep dive into the aquatic side of things. So doing a full aquatic survey of the site and the catchment from Loch Gillen down through the site and down to Loch Ness, and then combining it with environmental DNA analysis to understand how the different approaches can be compared and contrasted, looking at how we can measure and monitor changes in the river environment. Did some further work on the visualization, looking at doing some species modeling of elk and boar to talk about shifting baseline syndrome and the functional role that different species can have in ecosystems, and piloted that with the BBC's Country File on one of their shows. We set up a piece of work on remote biodiversity monitoring, so setting up camera traps and audio moths to try and collect and collate and analyze data on biodiversity in a cheaper and faster way. And then we also did a deep dive into peatland. There's a big peat bog on site, so we did a lot of monitoring and putting groundwater monitors and some coring, so we can better understand the carbon balance there and how we can restore that to store carbon in the peat. And then we've also been updating the natural, social, intellectual capital accounts, putting them into a new sort of improved digital platform, which is kind of more interactive and usable by different groups. That should be updated on the website this month. And then finally, just to take us to year 3. So this is kind of what we're going to be working on hopefully this year, looking at building on the VR work and presenting it at COP with the UK Green Business Council, and looking at how we can engage different groups in that. Continuing with the peatland monitoring and starting to make a plan to restore the peat and maximise the carbon sequestration. Developing the capital accounts further, so extending them to human, manufactured and financial capital, and looking at how we can improve the models and values that are used. Starting to integrate AI and machine learning into the biodiversity monitoring project so we can automate the analysis and collation of data. Looking at how remote sensing techniques can better measure carbon and look at how much carbon sequestration is happening on the site. I'm taking a baseline soil survey so we can understand what the condition of the soil assets are before significant change happens. And then developing a kind of like data management process and protocol to allow us to better use and make use of data and share it across different groups. And how we can set up sort of visualization of data in a kind of digital twin. And then final 2 pieces looking at what species are lost from the ecosystem, which ones could be brought back, and then working with nature metrics to pioneer air-based DNA techniques, which kind of look at what species are using the site, taking sampling from air. And yeah, that's a quick overview of the site. I realise I've run through a lot of things very quickly there. If we want to go into more detail on any of the metrics or the valuation work or any of the particular work streams that I mentioned, then more than happy to do that. Yeah, otherwise I'll hand back over to Justin.
Thanks, Chris. Great overview of that work again. Any initial questions to Chris from the room? Hi, Julie. Do you want to go ahead?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, Chris, really interesting presentation. I'm from the Maritime Archaeology Trust, and we're working as part of the SARCC project to look at how the archaeology and heritage can be used not only to see the long-term use and changes to the coastline, but how that's impacted human populations. I noticed there was no mention of any archaeology or heritage and human use and impact on that landscape, which would have had an ongoing effect over the last 10,000 years. And I was just wondering how you're taking that into account when you are choosing where to restore to, and you're talking about lost species. I'm just wondering from what time period and how you're taking that into consideration, considering, you know, imports into Britain and that sort of thing.
Yeah, funnily enough, we've just been talking with the kind of cultural heritage team about some of exactly those questions about how we deal with the cultural heritage of the site and how that fits in. There's some interesting stuff we're interested in around peat bogs and whether we can use the whether we can look at the value provided by peat bogs in kind of protecting and preserving archaeological remnants as a part of the value for protecting and restoring them. So we're working on that. We're looking specifically at how we can use the virtual reality to kind of take people on a long view history of the site. So starting from like glacial times to, you know, right through ideally, so you can have different scenarios in time and allow people to look at the landscape. Ultimately, what we'd like to do is allow people to kind of like talk about what they think the future landscape should be brought back to. But I don't know, they're sort of all open questions and we're still kind of like exploring what to do with it. There are some interesting kind of points in the landscape there, and there's a couple of cairns and kind of old stone buildings. And so we know it's a really rich and interesting area to explore. We haven't really dipped into that yet. So yeah, it'd be interesting to chat about, you know, maybe offline about some of your work in that area.
Yeah, sure. No, it sounds, yeah, that interesting stuff with potential with the peats as well. I imagine in terms of, I'm not quite sure about the exact depositional context, but potential dating there and paleoenvironmental analysis of that peat would actually give you that changing flora and faunal landscape over that long time depth.
Yeah. Great.
Hi, Bert.
Good morning.
Good morning. Go ahead.
Yeah, Chris, I wondered if is there any financial assessment made at the end of the project why private owners would fund this kind of research, or what the benefits would be financially, because that's one of the main questions that rise all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to clarify, ACOM's funding the work, and basically I spend a lot of my day job trying to convince other clients' finance departments to invest in nature-based solutions. And this project has been essentially me trying to convince ACOM to invest into nature-based solutions and trying to get a positive case for doing so. It is really interesting, and you can see some of the results on the website as a technical report, and the digital account's got some of the finance stuff. But through the natural capital accounts, we're producing what we're sort of calling like, or what I typically kind of call like it's basically like a profit and loss account for the project each year. In the first year we did it, it was a purely kind of natural and social capital thing, which looked at things like carbon benefits, biodiversity benefits, and this kind of whole range of natural and social capital impacts. The kind of the benefits we found significantly outweighed the cost of the project, which is, you know, really good, all well and good. But then what happens with a lot of the projects I work on, there's a difference between the externally accruing benefits and the private accruing benefits. So when you look at the private return on investment, it was actually pretty negative. And so what we've been doing over year two, I've been working quite closely with ACOM's finance team about how we can look at capturing some of the financial benefits from things like winning new work off the back of it, developing new innovative products, creating new opportunities and relationships and those sorts of things. And then we've developed this kind of like financial capital account, an intellectual capital account, which is looking at trying to quantify some of the value that's being generated. And we've now, on the basis of this, there's a really significant positive return on investment that we can make. And so we've essentially got two return on investments that we talk about. There's the one kind of, you know, when you're talking to a financial team, you can talk about the very strict sort of like private returns. And then there's a sort of broader, if you're taking a societal or wider look at things, there's sort of the wider picture of why it's a good idea to do this sort of things. But yeah, I think it's a big issue for nature-based solutions and the type of things that a lot of the benefits to things are going to accrue to people who are not the type of people, not the people who are investing the money in it. I think the kind of finance market for these kinds of things is changing, and it's evolving quite rapidly. In the UK, there's a lot of interest in things like carbon offsetting opportunities, the new ELM scheme, biodiversity net gains, a number of different markets. And so we're working with people to try and monetize some of these external benefits and allow people to get some of the benefits from these sorts of things. But it is, it's an evolving area, and especially at this stage, a lot of the challenge you get is, on the one hand, it's can we demonstrate that this is a good thing to do? And I think we're getting there for these kinds of schemes. But then the second one is, can we demonstrate that you should put your money into this project? You personally should back it when you may not get all the benefits it may accrue to people beyond your organization. I think there's a lot of creative and interesting discussions about kind of co-financing things and bringing in different partners, and it's quite an interesting, rich area, but a difficult one.
Okay, I'm quite interested in the results of that, because in Belgium we had a ecosystems study on the coast, on the whole Flemish Belgian coast. But it is exactly what you say, that the benefits are never flowing back to the people who invest, or the organization that invest, and there is a mismatch that still needs to be monitored or surveyed better. So I'm quite interested. So I can find results on the website then.
Yeah, I'll send you the. I guess I'll put the website in the chat. We're just in the process of updating it with the results from year 2, but everything from year 1 is there already, and we should have an update by the end of this month for year 2. Yeah, I think it is a difficult thing. I think there's a lot of stuff looking at innovative types of finance and things like, there's a lot of work around green and blue bonds, which is quite an interesting way of looking at community buyouts and public-private partnerships. I think, yeah, it's difficult to try and square this into a traditional financial way of looking at things, and it takes a bit of flexibility to do these kind of things. And I would say, I think once you've got one project that's worked and demonstrated it can work, it gets a lot easier the next time around. I mean, just speaking internally from Acon, when I first pitched this idea to them, it was sort of what's this kind of crackpot scheme? Why would you spend money on this? What's the point? But now it's demonstrated it can work, and it's a lot easier to do. So now the aim is to expand this globally. So we're setting up an NCR South in Australia, hopefully this year, and then kind of the idea is to have global network of sites. But, once you've done one and you've got that evidence base and you can demonstrate that it works, and it's not sort of ridiculous, it gets a lot easier, I think. And again, yeah, learning by doing and demonstrating and using pilots is a really good way, I think, of getting over that hurdle of just people's either bemused indifference or horror of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, just one remark. If you say it's a small project, in Flanders, 100 acres of forest would be a very big project. So, you can we could for us it's a very big approach already. So.
So I think that is one of the key takeaway messages, maybe from your work, Chris, and that Bert's referring to there, is that, because I look at what we sort of traditionally did. I sort of think about the sort of traditional flood and coastal defence economics, and it was always difficult or impossible to monetize those what we used to sort of refer to as intangibles, the intangible benefits which related to recreation, health and well-being, tourism, and so forth. Those benefits that you get from a sort of a general improvement of the environment and the public realm. And we have made, there have been sort of some progressions in terms of our funding model, looking to encompass those a little bit more and monetize them. And I know we've got internal EA economists looking at how we better monetize those external benefits. But there's clearly a lot of sophistication within your project in how you're sort of developing those metrics to to monetize those external benefits and create that what I think you referred to as the social capital. So I mean, I think it's really important perhaps that we stay sort of linked in with what you're doing and look to learn further, because I think it's a key area we need to develop.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge faced by everyone. I think when I started at ACOM about 10 years ago, this area of work was pretty niche and there wasn't much sort of interest in what we did. We used to have to try and convince people to listen to what we had to say, just to get a conversation. Whereas the situation we're in now, it seems like there's this massive interest in nature-based solutions, carbon offsetting, biodiversity projects, rewilding, natural capital. All the people we speak to have heard of these projects and are interested in it and want to do something. But there's a massive need for the kind of tools and approaches and models that are needed to allow this kind of thing to happen. And yeah, I think it's a really exciting moment in time because people are starting to invest. Whereas previously we'd just kind of make do with the kind of data or models that were available. Now people are actually committing real money into this and wanting it to work, and so it's driving sort of the innovation that's needed to allow this to happen. We're working with a company looking at a £130 million nature-based solution. The one's got sort of about 40,000 hectares of land that they're looking at whether they can put into nature-based solutions. When you're talking about these kind of figures and these kind of scales for lots of different companies at the same time, there's just a huge need for evidence and approaches and tools that work. And I think we'll see this whole sector move forward a lot faster than it has in a long time, just because there's a real need to do it.
Well, that's encouraging to hear that, I think, Chris. And I mean, yes, because I think, yeah, our sort of ambition and aspiration has leapt ahead of our sort of technical ability to actually deliver the projects. That's what's happened, and that's it's happened before. So we're playing catch up to an extent, but if the sort of the good intent is being backed up by investment, then we're on the right road, aren't we? And we're we're sort of hopefully in a better place than we were 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I think I guess one of the other, unless anybody else has sort of got any other sort of observations on that particular point, I was just going to sort of just refer back to one of the discussion points from the previous session around how you'd recognise that the capital accounting system was it's important to have that quantitative system in place, but actually the sort of spreadsheet approach can be a bit disengaging for people, and therefore the visual techniques that you were using, virtual reality, 3D modeling and so forth, you found that they're sort of pretty critical to success as well.
Yeah, and I'll give you a quick demo of something I didn't do last time. The accounts, which we tried to make sort of look pretty and that kind of thing, but essentially when you're wading into Excel and looking at numbers like this, it just almost nobody's engaged in that unless you're a technical person who's into finance and modeling. It's difficult to when you're talking about something exciting like biodiversity and habitats, this doesn't capture it, and you're only going to talk to a certain group of people, probably the finance teams that are going to respond to this. So, and we recognize that for these projects to work, you need a wide variety of stakeholders. It can't just be 1 or 2 people. The digital platform we developed was to basically try and have a piece of software to kind of present that information visually. So the software we've got now, which is up on here, this is the kind of in the year 1 report, which we kind of digitized and put into this platform, that allows you to kind of bring together video and images. And when you're talking about species, you can have the numbers but you can present it visually and allow people to respond. So as well as having a table, you can interact with it. And then when you're getting into kind of your asset register and your things like flows of ecosystem services, you can see how they're being provided in the landscape and how they're moving and where value is being added. I think that process, that process is people just respond to it a lot more engaged in a much more engaged manner. It allows you to talk about things like, well, the reason why we're actually not cutting down some of this plantation woodland is because we found that it's really important for red squirrels and pine martens. And so although it's a sort of, and you can start talking about some of these issues rather than just sort of saying, coming feedback with blank stares. I think you need that combination of the numbers which are going to convince finance teams, because that's ultimately what they want to see is the bottom line ROI, and then also the sort of the kind of like more engaging visual side, which if you're speaking to anyone outside of a finance team is what they're going to respond to.
Yeah, absolutely, and they need to support each other, but at the same time, sometimes they need to stand alone, don't they? Because I guess it's like it's not just that that a sort of spreadsheet approach might be disengaging some people. In fact, some people might actually be sort of opposed to the natural capital, the ecosystem being reduced to a sort of profit and loss sheet. In a way, it's it's just another indication of development and capitalism, sort of like controlling and removing the natural environment, isn't it? So I think that's a brilliant example. I like that. That visual content and narrative. It's a sort of a storytelling process, isn't it? Which just allows you to almost completely circumvent the numbers, I guess, for some of your stakeholders, to avoid that whole sort of issue of people being turned off by reducing it to a set of figures and a bottom line. But as you say, that is, we know as practitioners and working in this industry that's equally important in order to get funding secured to deliver more of this type of work.
Yeah.
But one of the other points that was raised in the first workshop was around the application of standards of protection. I mean, it's linked into sort of securing funding again, but there was sort of a point raised in the last session was, at the coast, we sort of think specifically at the coast, we've long been sort of quite wedded and reliant upon very specific standards of protection, which are provided by a fixed static defence crest, which then allows us to demonstrate a certain amount of benefits that we are derived by commercial and residential properties, say, that sit behind that defence. If we're trying to deliver the same benefits along with all of the other benefits that NBS can provide, can we expect to realistically develop an equivalent of that sort of traditional standard of protection approach that's been used for traditional engineering schemes, or do we need to look to something, an entirely different principle? I'm not sure if anyone's got any thoughts on how we might develop an equivalent standard of protection for where we're working with natural systems that might be in a state of flux, or where the standard of protection may develop and improve over many years. If you sort of drip feeding sediment to a denuded beach and dune system and improving the defence provided by those dunes as they grow and vegetate over time, your perceived standard of protection will increase over time. Any thoughts on that? Whether it's just something we need to sort of look at on a case-by-case basis. I suppose, Chris, in a way, maybe it goes back to that point around, we need to deliver, these initial pilot schemes and projects in order to work out how we do develop something which is an equivalent of a standard of protection, or do we just not? Is it just not applicable anymore? Is it actually sort of an outdated way of thinking? Potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the kind of like learning by doing thing is a really important component of this. I think one of the I guess one of the practical examples for the UK water sector was United Utilities' early work on SCAMP, which looked at doing a big kind of peatland restoration project in order to improve raw water quality and reduce kind of discoloration and water treatment costs. And the data and learning that they got from doing that has enabled kind of other water sector and like more broadly the kind of companies to adopt similar peatland restoration projects, because there was a data set and an evidence base collected over a number of years that made it easier for other people to do it. I think, you know, having that, the sort of the intellectual capital produced that allows you to demonstrate these kind of projects and work is a really useful thing. And you kind of, you just need to almost do the initial sort of pilot work sort of at risk. You know, a lot of the stuff we're doing on the lab is sort of stuff that we wouldn't do commercially, probably because we'd be worried about it all going wrong. You know, you kind of need to do those projects where you do it, you see what happens, and you monitor it, and there's going to be a lot of weird, unexpected stuff that comes back, but you collect the information and then use it to help make better decisions elsewhere in a more difficult environment. I think, you know, having those projects and collecting that data, you know, is useful for helping develop the standards and the approaches that can be used elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's what I think. It's that, yeah, that sort of point around risk, isn't it? It's sort of, you know, risk aversion versus risk appetite, and certainly something that we've been grappling with on the pilot work for Newlyn is, you know, as part of trying to initially deliver that work as part of a full Environment Agency scheme, was, you know, how does the risk get apportioned out? You know, traditionally our framework consultant would take on the risk of the design, but if we're asking them to work with a less tried and tested approach and maybe a completely untested material in a sort of highly dynamic coastal environment, then they're certainly prepared to take on less risk, which means then that, you know, us as the client, you know, we need to take on more of that risk. But yeah, I'm of the opinion that, you know, we need to do that because, you know, we're driving the agenda in terms of innovative projects and trying to deliver innovation. So we have to be prepared to step up and take on board some of that risk. And as you say, just accept that some of it won't go right, and we need to learn as we go. Of course, the issue that we've got is we're trying to deliver outcomes for communities, and, you know, people living within a flood risk area or an area subject to coastal change are likely to be less willing to sort of take on that risk, just in order to, you know, for wider learning to be developed, to be applied to other communities. They might sort of wonder why they are the test bed for that learning, and that, I suppose, that's then why residual, you know, risk management, managing the residual risks, you know, whether it's property level protection measures or sort of secondary measures which can assure that community that if your nature-based solution, while it's being developed, actually sort of doesn't perform as well as a traditional defence might, that actually they are still, you know, they are still protected in some way. So I think that residual risk management is a big thing for us, a big issue in terms of providing, you know, reassurance to communities that we're not just reliant on an untested, untried approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. In Middelkerke, they had the same issue with the SARCC pilot, where they wanted to create a dune in dike, and local government wasn't. So MDK was not convinced that dunes would withstand the same forces as concrete walls would, and they just asked the University of Ghent to provide, or Leuven, I don't know, to provide some new approaches and some calculations, and they just said, okay, let's go and try, but they convinced the local or the regional government to go and try. So it's Yeah, sometimes it's just taking the risk to do so, and of course everybody is now very interested in the first storms that would hit that new seawall or that new sea dike, and fingers crossed that it will turn out to be good. But
Yeah.